Sounds great. I want to welcome everybody who's here on our end, and I want to welcome you, Alan, to another session of the Reading Room. The space is a physical extension of the A.D. Coleman online seminars in practical criticism. Today we're going to be facilitating an open discussion between Alan and Dave Camp, but it is an open discussion, so I'm encouraging everyone to just jump in. Of course. I'll start with a brief introduction, even though it looks astonishingly not brief from my notebook. A.D. Coleman is a world-renowned writer, critic, lecturer, curator, and teacher, prolific, multifaceted, engaged, controversial. Coleman is the author of 8 books and over 2,000 essays on photo criticism and related subject matter, including a very intriguing recent collaborative work on Robert Capa, which I'm excited to see unfold in real time. You're also a pioneer of internet-based internet criticism, which I find remarkably intriguing, considering you started your website in 1995. Your online presence also includes a personal blog, which is updated regularly, and Photo Critic International, the Photography Criticism Cyber Archive, and the online teaching resources, the New Eyes Project in Teaching Photography. And I think that those are going to come up a bit in conversation today. I'll turn it over to Dave just to get our discussion started. Dave Camp has his PhD show opening on June 19th at the Macintosh Gallery here on the campus of Western University. The exhibition is called The Things You Know But Cannot Explain. Dave uses video and photography to investigate how different combinations of knowledge can shape our understanding of the world. So his interest lies in modes of knowledge transfer that are either singular or very limited in what they provide, and he focuses on the mundane and the everyday, using these limited modes to explore their potential to shape our understanding of the world. He's got a series called Series of Boring videos, which uses the familiar expressions of a watched pot, paint drying, and watching the grass grow. The viewer is invited to engage these off-cited idioms in what Dave calls a process of extended looking. He's also designed the one-pixel camera, a suspiciously analog-looking device, to create a series of color field monochromes. These digital photos are severely restricted in their ability to record, but these restrictions also serve to play with how we have come to photographically engage with such cliched and familiar experiences as birthday parties and tourist attractions. The Things You Know But Cannot Explain marks the conclusion of Dave's visual arts PhD at Western. He also holds a Master of Visual Studies from the University of Toronto, a BFA in Image Arts from Ryerson, and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Queen's. So, with all of that, I'll hand it over to Dave. I'll ask you to just give us a bit of a discussion about your practice, specifically from this vantage point now, okay, and maybe we'll just take it from there.
Sounds good. I guess I can start with a little bit of background. As you mentioned, I started off in engineering. It was sort of one of those things of getting a good job, even though photography and art was always my passion. But then coming from there, that's always sort of been part of things. I've always been very interested in science and technology. And in many ways, that's informed a lot of my work. And I'm very interested in the ways that science and technology affects the way we understand and sort of experience the world. And also going the other way, how our actual experience of the world affects science and technology. And this sort of extended, I was going through, again, I just did when I was at my master's at U of T, I also did a collaborative program, which was called Knowledge Media Design. And it was more sort of science and technology studies, so sort of the sociology of science and sociology of technology and how, again, the political nature of technology sort of comes into play and stuff like that. And that, again, has sort of shaped a lot of what I was doing. And then later coming into the PhD, I was very interested again in the differences, well, both the social impact of science and technology, but also differences between sort of an artistic way of knowing and a scientific way of knowing. But it's kind of extended a little past that because those aren't really exclusive categories, but getting more into different types of knowledge. Particularly, I've been working a lot with Michael Polanyi's notions of tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge. So more the types of knowledge, like sort of the written text, the written word that can be communicated very easily, it can be transferred, versus the more intangible forms of knowledge that artists work with. Although not exclusively, because again, obviously artists use text, they use other things, But I'm very interested in these two ways of knowing and finding, particularly within my PhD, that that intuitive sort of intangible type of knowledge is really not accepted and kind of worked with. Like everything has to be written down. Again, it's a very explicit form of working, and it is a bit of a strange thing. Particularly, I found less so at the master's level because art, like creative art practice at a master's level, is fairly well established at this point. But the PhD level, it's still a very new thing. Like just as a bit of an update, you may know this, but there's only 2 programs in Canada, and have we lost you, or I think we've lost him?
Oh no. Alan? I wonder how much of that he got. I heard a cough at one point.
Yeah, just a minute ago.
Shoot, live. Can you hear us? Oh, should we keep going? I'm kidding. We should keep going. Let's see.
Ah, okay. Now you're back.
You're back. Good.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Shall we continue? What was the last thing that you heard?
The last thing I heard was you were talking about artistic practice in your MFA or MA experience versus the more rigorous demands of the PhD process.
Well, it wasn't just the demand specifically, but just the nature of what I guess is kind of expected, and even down to like granting and funding and stuff like that. In the sense, like one of the things we have sort of the SHIRK sponsorship or the SHIRK grants. That's one of the main things that students kind of have to sort of help support their academic studies. And the thing that gets a bit challenging is you have to frame your work or whatever your research is as a generation of new knowledge. And trying to frame artistic production as generating new knowledge is a very difficult thing to do. But at the same time, the granting bodies are sort of set up with more of a classic humanities or classic sort of, even like a science model. SHIRK is more humanities based. So trying to frame a creative practice and how that is tangible knowledge becomes a very weird thing to do. And then additionally too, which obviously is something I knew very well going into this, but even the fact of, or the process of writing a massive like written dissertation about your own work is a very strange thing to do. And again, there is a certain amount of almost like dodging and avoiding. Like you want to tell a little bit, but not too much, because you don't want to suddenly fix the work. You don't want to over-explain it. You want to leave some things open, but at the same time, there's a requirement that you explain it enough that it meets the criteria and the expectations. And it is this weird kind of back and forth, push and pull sort of thing that becomes a bit of a challenge. And I'm still, I've got a dissertation that's been sort of basically accepted now. There's a few things that I wish I didn't have to explain as thoroughly as I did, but they're kind of demanded by my committee. And then, anyway, so it's just a bit of a strange process sometimes. But
yeah, I have serious reservations about the idea of an art PhD. I mean, a studio art PhD, and in fact, I have deep reservations. I've been writing about them last couple of years over the whole idea of post-secondary studio art programs, but that's probably a whole other discussion for us to get into, unless you want to hear it some other time. But
I understand a lot of debate over it, and I'm still having some issues with it too.
I want to get into that debate today.
So, okay, yeah.
But we can, it's certainly something we can pick up at another date. But I one of the things that I saw as I very quickly browsed your various projects that Ruth sent to me. I'm getting some kind of feedback there from your end, I think.
Just get away from the speaker a bit.
Yeah.
How's that?
I think that sounds better.
Okay.
No, I'm hearing me. Why am I hearing me?
You're getting the speakers coming through the mic, probably.
Okay.
I should turn you down a little bit here.
One of the things that I did feel was that there is actually some scientific premise. I'm still getting the feedback.
Maybe we should try just through the computer for a bit.
We weren't getting it just before though, so I don't know why that's happening. Put it close to the computer. That's fine. I'm not hearing myself now.
Yeah, that's fine.
So one of the things that I noticed was that there are a certain kind of testable hypotheses that you're working with that to me make a number of your projects into genuine theses that are testable. I was particularly interested in the one pixel camera for the following reasons. So sometime I haven't checked my files, but sometime probably about 20 years ago, I was giving a lecture in somewhere in Europe. I think it was Frankfurt, on digital issues at that time. This would have been about 1994 or something like that. And one of the things that I predicted was that digital imaging was going to enter what I would call a formalist period, in which a certain kind of, I'll call it hermeneutic inquiry into the nature of the medium itself was going to happen. Usually when a new technology gets introduced, you start out with a kind of what would be called, in regard to the printing press, an incunabula phase, where basically people are just like, oh wow, you can do this, oh wow, you can do that. It's just completely unsystematic, right? Just trying stuff out, right? Messing around with it, right? Which is this is not, I'm not saying this in a critical sense. It's fine. It's just normal with a new technology. Then you get to the next phase, which is what Marshall McLuhan called the rear view mirror phase, where basically you use the new technology to imitate the old technology. Right?
Yeah.
So you get movies, and what do? You film what are basically stage dramas, right? You get television. What do? You imitate radio and movies, right? Etc. Right?
Imitating painting.
You get photography, you imitate painting.
Yeah,
Right?
the pictorial.
So then with digital, a lot of it was digital photography. A lot of it was replicating what had been done in analog photography, right? Oh, look, you can make landscapes. Oh, look, you can do this, right? But I've always assumed there's going to be some point where somebody would say, and this is what I call a formalist phase, what is inherent to the nature of this medium? What does this medium do that no other medium does? And we enter phases like that with painting, where, well, there's the brush stroke, and there's the canvas, and there's this, right? And we enter this stage with photography, right? What is grain, right? And so forth. So what is the pixel, and what can you do with just the pixel that you can't do with anything else? Seems to me, in that sense, to be a very, very formalist hermeneutic question to ask about the very nature of the medium itself. So I'm interested in that experiment. It's a very interesting thought experiment to run, and your results. Okay, it's one pixel of the color of somebody's party dress or whatever it is, or one pixel of the sky at somebody's wedding is. It's an image. It's even a document on some level, right? So this intrigues me.
We've lost you again. Okay.
We lost
good.
you for a second there.
You're back.
Yeah, now you're back. So that intrigues me as a kind of experiment to see what can be done, but also because it starts to query the nature of the medium that we're using, and part of what has disturbed me about digital photography is that it basically returns photography to being a black box medium, meaning people more or less were understanding what happened in the camera. I mean, the analog camera. I think people by the late 1980s, generally widespread, had enough visual literacy that they sort of understood, yeah, light comes in and it goes this way and that way, and the image is upside down, and you end up with this, and it's a negative, and then you make it a positive. And the other, but digital photography is a complete mystery. So it remystifies the medium right at a moment when people had sort of come to understand its basics, and anything that exposes the workings of the system, to me, is useful and important.
Well, that's very much what I'm trying to do. Some of the other things I'm interested in is also the design of the camera itself. And more looking at, again, this is coming from some of my interest in sort of technology studies, but just the way that the actual design of whether it be a camera or any objects around us actually prescribes certain types of behavior. And coming from various theory and sort of science and technology studies, also a little bit with lens flisseur and a few things like that, the program of the camera, and how the technology will actually dictate the type of things that you can actually do with it. So that was also another factor in there, as well as just dealing with the pixel as sort of its own entity. I was interested in producing this incredibly restricted design that forced you, or not necessarily forced you, but really made you work in a certain way. So it was a combination of many sort of things going on at the same time with it. And I do like the fact that you picked up on the black box. That was, again, it's actually a term used in science and technology studies specifically. And obviously that's the actual structure of the thing is very intentionally a black box.
Right. Yeah, I knew Flusser a bit. We met at a symposium in Vienna in 1981, and I think he was very useful in a lot of ways. But in other ways because he did not really have any direct experience with photography himself. There's areas in which I think he thought the things were the program, were part of the program that were not part of the program, right? He thought, for example, that throwing the camera in the air violated the program of the camera, and there's nothing in the camera that requires that, right? Putting an image out of focus does not violate the program of a camera that allows you to put things in focus or out of focus. Right? So
I could also say it's not necessarily allowing you, and this is coming from some other things that I'm into, more like Bruno Latour and stuff like that there is more of, it may not be an actual restriction of working with something in a certain way, but sort of a push to use it in a certain way, or sort of a mandated way, or something that makes one way easier to do something than another way. And he uses a weird example of like basically his seatbelt alarm, where when he got in his car, you can drive away without buckling your seatbelt, but you get this really annoying pinging alarm.
Right.
Could still do it, but at the same time, it doesn't. It's really awkward. It's uncomfortable, and you have to go out of your way to go around, I guess, the program of the car, if you will. So, and I think with the camera, there is a number of things that do prescribe a certain way of working with the camera. Some cultural, some specifically within the physical nature of the camera. But at the same time, you can go around and sort of defeat them and play with them. And I think that's what some of Lesueur was sort of advocating, is more a breaking of it, if you will.
Yeah, I would simply make a more clear distinction than he made between cultural attitudes of what makes a good picture, that let's say suggest that sharp focus is best, right? Versus a camera that does not give you the option of making an out of focus picture, right? Like let's say your standard point and shoot, right?
Yeah.
Does not really give you that option. I mean, you can probably jiggle it or whatever while you're doing it in order to make an out of focus picture, but it's really its program is very specifically designed to put whatever is closest to the picture plane and to make that thing sharpest, the most brightly lit, et cetera, et cetera. That's a program. Giving someone a handbook that goes with the camera that says basically here's how you get a sharp picture, and most people like their picture sharp.
Yeah.
That's a different thing, I think, than the program of the camera, right? So I wish that Willem had understood that better and had made that distinction more clearly. I think it's a limitation of his theory.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that totally.
I wanted to pick up on something you said at the very beginning about how you were thinking now that digital photography is creating a return to this black box. And so I guess you mean people just don't know what it is that they're carrying around in their pocket. And I'm wondering if you see dangers in that or consequences and oversights, if you wanted to speak to that, and then maybe have Dave respond and anybody else here respond.
Sure.
Otherwise.
Well, my thought here is that up until George Eastman's, Kodak #1, basically, the you push the button, we do the rest camera. In order to practice photography, you actually, that is, in order to make photographs, you actually had to practice photography, meaning in almost all cases, you had to know how to not only press the button, but you had to know how to develop and print. And while this was not as democratic in terms of as widespread a set of skills as just making exposures and having someone else do it, it meant that you had to understand the mechanism you were working with. You had to understand the tool. And I think that was a valuable skill for people to have, and certainly I would say more people had that skill than had any of the previous skills in visual representation, right? In whether that was drawing or painting or making images through the camera obscura or the camera lucida, etc. More people knew how to make photographs, and that means making them all the way through from exposure through uh, making a final photographic print of it, or making a daguerreotype in some cases. More people knew how to do that probably at that point than had ever known in the history of the world cumulatively how to make drawings or other graphic representations. So in that sense, it spread the skill, not only the skill of making images, of generating images, but the skill of actually understanding the system that you were using to make those images. It actually had spread that very widely. Now, I don't say this to wish that Eastman had never invented, the Kodak #1, but just to make the point that thereafter, the idea of, or the activity of making exposures got severed from the activity of following through with that, so that you never needed to understand the system you were working with, right? And that once again makes of the camera a black box, which in many cases, which it literally was. I mean, it was the Kodak #1 was a little black box. It makes it in the theoretical sense a black box once again, because people don't understand what's going on in it, right? Now, I would say that gradually, cumulatively over time through the 20th century, with all the information that we have about basic photography readily available, I would say that most visually literate people would have had a fundamental grasp of how the camera worked by the 1980s, right? Right at the point where the digital camera comes along, and very, very few people really understood what's going on, except, well, it's a digital version of what happens in the analog camera. Well, not really. Not really. #1, because as we talked about last week, it makes it possible to make images without making objects. But because the fact of the matter is that that with an analog camera, there is an actual physical, chemical record of something that happened at a very specific given moment on that negative, right? I mean, it may be subjective, it may be all these things that we talk about, but it is an actual irreplaceable, unique record of what happened at that moment. But a digital file is simply a set of ones and zeros. It is not an actual record in the same way of a physical chemical encounter with the light bouncing off something at that moment. Right? It has a different existence. It has a different essence, as it were, as an artifact. So it's not exactly comparable. And you can go in and literally change that thereafter pixel by pixel, which you can't do with an analog negative. So it's a different kind of image and a different kind of experience of images that we're getting there. And I think, I mean, I'm glad to see the emergence of things like the Raspberry Pi. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this tiny little
That's
computer.
actually what's in the 1 pixel camera, incidentally.
Really? There you go. All right.
Computer that's running it. So.
Because it's something that enables. There are a number of things coming out now that enable amateurs and kids to mess around with computers, including computerized cameras and so forth, and literally build them from scratch and program them and learn how these things are made. So I think that the generation after ours, right, or after yours, I should say, not I'm way older than you guys. I'm your grandfather practically, but the generation after yours is the generations coming up now are going to be much more not just computer literate, but computer tech literate than we are. And they're going to grow up, at least the educated ones among them are going to grow up from childhood on, messing around with the innards of computers. And I think it's going to be a lot less mystifying for them, a lot less black box for them, than it is, let's say, probably for someone like me, even someone like you, Ruth. I'm going to guess, haven't had that much sort of hands-on, fooling around with the insides of computers. Dave's a different case, obviously, right?
Mechanical engineering.
Yeah, right.
Computer geek before that even anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting to hear it's the Raspberry Pi because I'm working with a colleague on developing a program for he teaches photography in a school that's basically it's actually a full K-12 school, meaning they have all the grades pre-K-12, all the pre-secondary grades, and he runs the photography program, and we've been swapping ideas and information back and forth. And as I keep coming across various kinds of new, we'll call them toys, but they're very serious toys for kids that are basically things for helping them to work with computers, to build digital cameras, etc. I keep feeding them to John and he back to me. And one of them, of course, was the Raspberry Pi, which we're both sort of delighted to find, and he's already using this in his classes. So I think there's something happening there in terms of how this technology is now being demystified for younger people. That's very important, and in some ways, your one pixel camera is a kind of it's a kind of thing that I would like those kids to see. So they understand, well, you could, and how about a 2-pixel camera, and how about a 5-pixel camera, and how about a camera that just shows you 1 pixel from selected parts of the viewing field, rather than a whole image, because the possibilities of what you're going to be able to do with this technology are so different from the possibilities of what you can do with an analog technology.
Yeah. There are a few kind of younger artists that are getting a lot of critical attention now. This is where my personal research interest lies, like people who were born around 1970 and on, who've just grown up with this idea that photographic representation is a given. So it's become an easy, acceptable, it's always in the back of your mind, but now they're addressing that in a lot of different ways. So I'm wondering if anybody would like to offer up particular means of addressing that you find more successful than others, or particular questions or kind of conflicts that you see happening in work that's starting to kind of come to the fore in general art production, as it were.
And sorry, could you go back to the beginning with the actual?
But just like you talked about the photo object, and there are a few artists who are kind of making a return to printed photos, but now they're trying to almost make them as they're challenging them as much as they can. So whether they're using them in 3-dimensional sculpture works, or whether they're messing with them on computers and painting with them digitally, or what have you. And I'm just wondering if either of you have any particular artists in mind who you see are doing that kind of successfully, or do you see any particular challenges that you haven't seen addressed yet, or like where do you see that kind of conversation being right now? It's a very broad kind of not specific question.
Let me think about it for a sec.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, Dave is coming out of this sort of immediate environment of people who are making photographs with all kinds of technologies, old and new. So I want to hear what you've got to say about that as a context, because I mean there was a time when the photograph, if you were in a photography program, and let's say in 1975 or so, which is about 7-8 years after I start my work, pretty much you were making one of two kinds of things. You were either making black and white gelatin silver prints, or you were making color prints, and there were people exploring with all kinds of other stuff, right? And doing etching and engraving and 3-dimensional work and bookworks and so forth and so on. But the range was comparatively small, and if you go back 10 years before that to 1965, you were either making gelatin silver prints or you were making color prints, and the color prints had to be commercially processed at that point, because doing color printing yourself was very, very difficult and actually very unhealthy. So I mean, a photo program circa 1965 was basically a gelatin silver program using analog cameras, obviously, and going to a print size of maybe, well, 16 by 20 was considered bravura, and everything bigger than that was considered bragging, right? So I mean, so the objects, when I came into the the field in the late 60s, when you walked into a photo show, the basic implication, even before you got close to the work, right, and saw what it was about, saw its content, right, and saw what it was of and what it was about, the basic understanding was that if you were going to engage with photography, you were going to engage with these small objects, and you were going to get up close to them and squint.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't say that to be particularly sarcastic, but I mean, there was a uniformity that some people were beginning to challenge, but there was a basic uniformity, and 9 out of 10 photo shows would be that. You would not be able to read the image from across the room. You would get up close to it, and you were supposed to look very closely at it, and it was going to be most probably a black and white photograph. It might be toned, it might be hand colored, etc. But so it was going to have a certain look. And suddenly, even in analog photography, there was then this explosion of diverse forms. Now we see with digital added to that, because it hasn't really replaced those forms. Now we see this incredible diversity of things that people are doing, which actually I think makes it almost impossible to be anymore a photo critic per se, or a photo historian per se, unless you very specifically set up some kind of demarcation, right? I mean, I'm going to be a critic of gelatin silver photography in the new millennium, in the aughts and the 21, the post 20th century, because there's so much stuff being done that participates in the photographic, if we can use that idea, without actually being photographs, or without only being photographs. That it gets very hard to define a territory that is still photography.
Actually, this is another term that's used. There's a gallery in Toronto. Actually, it was originally the Toronto Photographers Workshop that later became Gallery TPW, just because they had to sort of change and they started moving away from traditional photography to showing lots of other things. Right. And the thing they use is just photo-based art. So they're a gallery that shows photo-based art, and photo-based art could be video. It could even be performance in some cases. Right. They show. It's kind of a catch-all umbrella term that they use quite nicely. And
I use the term lens-based imagery.
Okay. Yeah.
A lot. So.
And it's a nice sort of umbrella term, because again, there are so many things, and it gets a lot of boundaries are just kind of blurred, and I think that's actually kind of good in a lot of ways. And I think I was hesitating a little bit when you first asked the question, because I know when I went to photo school, which was early days of digital, if you will, but at the same time, so many people were doing so many different things. Like there was people working with, a lot of cyanotypes. You had three-dimensional cube-like sculptures. You'd have things printed with liquid light on porcelain. You'd have it was like all sorts of different things. A lot of people working with found imagery, where you'd just be collaging something from like media images. Again, video works with projections on the body. Like there's so many different things going on that when you're asking about specific cases, it was kind of like almost like an overwhelming, like it was just like that's what was going on all around. So I think that's why I was hesitating a little bit in terms of, but again, there is a lot of different pushing of things, and in fact, photography is this sort of pure sort of form, I think again, it's a very almost like ghettoized sort of thing, where there are certain galleries in certain places where that happens, but they tend to be, there's specific photography things and it's a bit of a different area. So anyway, just as a thought, I guess.
Nice.
But
you said that you had a few questions that you were thinking you might. Is now a good time?
I guess we could. One thing, actually, this is just sort of a weird thing, but remember we had an earlier reading group.
Yeah.
And I think we're actually talking about notes on the index or something. That doesn't really matter. But I remember getting in a bit of a weird debate. I think it was with Michael over, and this is going back to like your directorial mode, but that notion of believing a photograph.
Mhm.
And I think in your case, you're talking about a suspension of disbelief in the directorial type of photographs. But when I was having this debate or talk with Michael, again, his brother works for the Globe and Mail and is sort of does like digital photo work on it. And he has absolutely no belief in photography whatsoever and was almost putting it on the same level as painting. Now, for me, there still is something to a photograph. I understand it's manipulated and everything else. And maybe it's something much like you're saying about that bit of reality imprinted on the film, which I might see also in a digital form. But at its core, no matter how manipulated and morphed around and composited and everything else, there is still some element of the real present in any photograph. And for me, that has a very different reading than a painting. I just maybe could use that as a bit of an opening up for discussion just to see where people might, I don't know if that's like an open discussion, but just something to talk about. Because it's something that it was just a weird discussion. I've had similar talks with people too, and there still is something to photography that is different than anything else, really.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, one way or another, whether we still have that physical chemical connection to the moment in analog image, or whether we're looking at a digital image, we still have the fact that is the light that bounced off the surface. I mean, it's a representation of the actual light that bounced off the surface of that stuff out there, whatever that stuff is, right? And even if it's an out of focus, whether it's deliberately or accidentally an out of focus image, it reads. We know how to read an out of focus photograph. I mean, we don't necessarily know how to sharpen it, but we know it's an out of focus photograph, and that's different from a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, right, of that flower. It might not be a better image, but it's different from it in kind. And I think that we've learned to treat those images differently in our heads because of that, because we know that some instrument, presumably with some person behind it, whether they were literally there or put it there, some instrument made that record, made that description of that, and that it has a recordative function that in some ways, at least after the advent of photography, painting never had. Even history painting, which people took as representational or not representational, but sort of informational, right? Christian iconography, in painting, which people took as well. That's how Jesus looked. He had his white robes and the beard, right? Everybody knew that, and they knew that from pictures, right? They didn't, Jesus doesn't have any white robes and beards in the Bible, right? He's not naked, but nobody knows what he looks like in the Bible. There's no description of him.
It's sort of a weird thing that people read in an odd way, but that's another story.
Yeah. So people believed they knew things from paintings, or engravings, or etchings, or drawings, or whatever. But photography displaces that. But the fact of the matter is, there is something that happens there. You can't introduce a painting as evidence in a courtroom, and for all of our discussions about the subjectivity of photography and the manipulability of it and so forth and so on, photographs can still be made in ways that they serve as legal documentation of all kinds of things, everything from your car crash to crimes, right? And it's probably going to stay that way because there is some credibility to the lens-derived image that no other medium gives us.
And still, but there's also still a lot of debate, and again, it's sort of, I think, a fine line as well in terms of, again, as you're saying, can be done in a certain way. And people do tend to get quite up in arms. Like, I'm thinking of two different cases. Like, one that I hear a lot of controversy about is particularly in scientific imagery. If you have astronomy or microscope type imagery that they've added false color to or somehow cropped in, but particularly the adding of false color. And the reality is, like a lot of telescope type imagery, it's not dealing with visible light. It's dealing with X-rays or some other form of things. So
radio waves that have been transformed into imagery. Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing, but then an artist will come along and add color and present this as a scientific image. Now, I think this is also coming from the culture of science that should be producing facts. And you suddenly have this colorized thing where someone has subjectively gone in and said, this is red, this is green, this is whatever. And there is some resistance to that. And another case, this was something I was encountered just recently, but it was from a little while ago, but I think there was quite a bit of a debate. It was like the 2012 World Press photo I'm sure you probably, there was like it was basically the one that won. They had a big controversy over being manipulated, and the article I was reading, they were doing almost like a forensic analysis of the JPEG image and figuring out if it was pixel per pixel and finding weird little, like it was more than just burning and dodging. I think there had been a couple of composites and a few people had been changed, and it's like this being the world press sort of photo, like the epitome of photojournalism, if you will. There was a lot of debate whether that was still a legitimate document of the event. And in both cases, like there is sort of a weird thing, and I'm just wondering, perhaps I guess in terms of a question, is like what can that standard be where it still does serve as a legal document, and is that necessary? And is there ever a case, like it's never really truth, quote unquote, it's always something, but again, there is a level of believability, but it's not a hard and fast. And I find that drawing of that line a bit of a challenging thing, and I don't know where to put it or if we even should put it there, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think from a legal standpoint, I think the ideal, the goal, the standard would be a a digital file that has not been altered in any way. I mean, speaking strictly legally, right? Here, and there should, I mean, your digital files come in time dated, right? Automatically by your digital camera.
Which can
and
change too, but that's another.
Which can be messed with, but I think that there are ways of detecting that it can be messed with, right? So it could be messed with superficially in a way that'll get past the basic scrutiny, but a forensic computer expert can determine that a file has been altered. This is my understanding. In any case, maybe you may know more about this than I do, but that's my understanding. Now, obviously, there's always going to be this sort of contest between hackers trying to get past any such safeguards and so on. So, as possible that at any given moment, the hackers are going to be in the lead, and therefore that something can be falsified, right, in some way, or confounded. But the fact of the matter is that I, from a legal standpoint, that would seem to me to be the logical standard, that you want a file that has not in any way been altered or corrupted, and to the extent that we're able to verify that at any given moment, to me that's the legal standard. Now, the legal standard is not necessarily the what should we call it, the reportorial standard, right, or the journalistic standard. Because first of all journalistic activity is interpretive, no matter how much we hold up the idea of objectivity. More and more, we're understanding the inevitable subjectivity of the journalist, including the photojournalist, right? And therefore, the inevitable subjectivity of the photograph as a journalistic artifact. But the fact is, still, what you want to see is what the photographer shot, and I think to their credit, in journalism generally, in the newspaper or magazine world generally, they have established from the beginning of their use of digital photography, they've established fairly clear guidelines, which says, well, you can do certain kinds of minor adjustments that make the color more attractive, or that eliminate certain kinds of superficial artifacts, like highlights that will distract the viewer's eyes, etc. But you can't change the basic information. You can't move the pyramids closer together, because that makes for a better cover, which is I think the first big digital imaging controversy, if I remember correctly, over National Geographic doing that. You can't remove you can't remove things or people from the image. You can't do the commissar vanishes. You can't do a number of things. But you can basically do a certain amount of change of contrast, etc., to make the image work better on the page and be a little more attractive to the eye. But that's it. And anything beyond that, you have to label it photo illustration or something like that. And so we actually have not had, surprisingly to me, over the 20 years now that we've had digital images appearing in periodicals, we have not had scandal after scandal after scandal. We've had a series, but I mean it's not like every day there's a new revelation that this or that noteworthy image has been doctored or falsified in some way. It's just a series of instances, and with each instance, and this again I think speaks very favorably to the industry. There's been public discussion, there's been reprimand of the people involved, there's been loss of credibility, people have gotten fired, the whole thing has been made public, there's been public debate about it as a consequence, etc. So in my opinion, the industry, let's call it the journalistic industry or the newspaper industry or the periodicals industry, has behaved very responsibly in regard to all this, and has almost immediately made public all cases, including the World Press Photo thing, which was, believe me, I know those people. This was a huge embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
This was a huge embarrassment to the organization, to the industry, etc. But they felt the immediate need to make this public and to correct it. So in that sense, it's not that we can completely trust what we see, but the industry has made a major effort to make itself as trustworthy as it can be. And keep in mind, none of this was new. I mean, there were falsified photographs, still, I mean, analog photographs
from the beginning
before digital came along. And I would say that the scrutiny level has gone up rather than down. As a result of the introduction, scrutiny level within the industry has gone up rather than down as a result of the introduction of digital imaging. So I'm not anxious about that. But with that said, the possibility of something slipping through and now going viral, and therefore becoming irretrievably a kind of factoid, a term that Norman Mailer invented, a kind of factoid out there floating around in the blogosphere or the digital online world forever, that's increased, right? So stuff gets out and circulates before you can say, wait a minute, this is fake. And you're saying that it's fake is not going to stop people from coming across it 5 years or 10 years or 15 years from now and reviving the idea that it's not fake.
Just wondering, as a question, could this be putting the photograph in a similar position to the written word? Because in the sense with like journalism or anything else, like you can easily fake a text that could be distributed. And again, there's a certain industry self-regulating where if you're caught plagiarizing or caught, I don't know, just basically creating a fake story, it will come back to haunt you in some way. I'm just wondering if the photograph maybe has, and it might be an exciting thing for the photograph to actually lose that sort of idea that it is this little piece of untouchable truth and just allow it to function much like a text. And it allows for a certain flexibility of reading within the image, that it's read based on who produced it, where it's coming from, what it's actually showing, and you actually be critical over it, not just believing it because it is a photograph, and that by its very nature makes it truthful. That's a little bit of a weird thing. So it might, perhaps it's a move towards a different form of visual literacy that may actually be an exciting and good thing.
I agree absolutely. I think that we should have been questioning photographs all along, right? Not in a sort of let's impeach them all Susan Sontag mode, but asking that kind of question about them all along. The fact that we didn't is a kind of bizarre cultural curiosity to me.
Something to be purely objective. Like it makes it easy if you do have this thing that's absolute truth, and you can just put it up there. This is the truth. You don't have to debate it.
Well, of course, you don't have to think about it, right?
Sorry?
Think about it. So yeah, it makes life easy. But the fact that we did that for so long to me is this sort of a curious historical artifact within the culture. But I absolutely agree. We should have been questioning them from the start. It's way overdue. I think it's very healthy for them to be questioned and for it to be understood. This is coming from an individual. This isn't an image from God. This came from an individual. It is by definition subjective, no matter how truthful the person was trying to be. It's by definition subjective, and we should have been talking about its subjectivity and should now talk about its subjectivity and its limitations as communication, as information and as data. We should be talking about its limitations, right alongside talking about the possible bias of whatever the written report is that goes with it, or its caption or whatever. Absolutely, no question to me. So I think that's an actual healthy development, that people are now questioning the veracity, the automatically assumed veracity of photographs. I think that's a great thing.
And it extends into painting and to literature. I just immediately think of Gerhard Richter paintings of photos and how it's trying to capture that experience of looking at an image and then even trying to recall it after the fact, so you get that Gerhard Richter effect. Or Michael Ondaatje, where you're presented with an empty frame and then you're described an image and then you're forced to believe that it existed and then recreate it yourself. So it's a really rich territory to mine, and this idea of truth immediately gets people prickly, and reality gets people prickly, and subjectivity gets people prickly. So I don't see why you can't expand it into more of a conversation than a binary of it's either or. It's nifty.
Are you saying prickly?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I'll hold it close. Prickly. I'll enunciate a little.
Is that a Canadianism or your generationism, or is that just you?
That's probably just me. I also say soda pop.
Well, that's an American. Well, actually, no, I guess that's a mix of two.
Prickly? I mean, we have the word, but I haven't heard it used in that context. But that's fine.
You learned something new.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I do have some more questions, but does anyone else have anything? Okay, well, I can ask another, bring up on another topic of conversation, which actually is going to some things we were talking about earlier. But we're talking about the difference between film-based photography and digital photography. And it actually seems strangely, I've found with a lot of the younger students and also some of my colleagues, there is still either return to film or a certain nostalgia for film or use of film within an art context. And a lot of people, strangely, are shooting film, scanning it, and then working with it digitally and then printing, which seems, it's a bit of a roundabout sort of way, but there is something about working with film that seems to be very, I don't know, just a lot of people seem to be drawn towards that. And again, it's a lot of, I think, in many cases, it's a lot of younger students that I don't think they actually grew up in a time when film was the main source of photography, or I guess they would be kind of in that era, but probably in terms of when they were entering photography, they probably entered directly into digital, and there's a certain nostalgia to it. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts in terms of how film might live on, if it should live on. Like, is it something, again, beyond the more, if you will, sort of metaphysical kind of notion of the film actually recording that piece of reality, in terms of more the aesthetic qualities or something else, the sort of benefits or disadvantages, or just any thoughts on basically film either vanishing or film sort of still sticking around a little bit, I guess, to sort of summarize a bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously it is still here. We're what, 20 some years, more than that, down the road from the advent of digital imaging, and film is still here. I think there's probably always going to be a niche market, let's call it, for film-based photography, and even for the entire film-based through developing and printing and printing via analog methods on photographic paper. You know, we're talking maybe on two different levels, Dave. There's one level which is the level of the cultural utility of, let's call it now, lens-based imagery, right? And on that level, everything is going to go digital if it hasn't already, right? I mean, all your everyday, mundane, quotidian, vernacular usages of photography are in the process of going digital, and are going to stay digital, and will stay digital. There's no reason, because it is so much more fast, it is so much more efficient, it's so much easier to store, that there would be no reason to maintain an analog practice in passport photography or luggage photography or even news photography. It's not useful. It's counterproductive to work with those methods. So I would expect that the current generation of news photographers or photojournalists are all working with digital cameras, and they're doing multimedia projects because they can move now from video to still, and they can record sound at the same time with tiny little portable cameras, etc. They may learn analog photography because they may decide that they want to make prints. They may not, but they may decide that they want to make prints for a market or for some other reason. But the fact of the matter is that we are also, I was talking about this last time, we're tactile, sensual creatures, and we enjoy finely crafted and interestingly crafted physical objects, and we enjoy making those objects. And I don't think that's going to stop. And photographic practice, the traditional photographic practice, is a form of making. And I don't want to compare it to ceramics or macrame or whatever, but it's a craft, and people enjoy practicing that. Some people enjoy practicing that craft. It's a sensually fulfilling, intellectually and creatively fulfilling craft to practice. And I think there are going to be people who are going to be drawn to it for the foreseeable future. Meaning for the next century at least, right? Assuming that we're still here and assuming that the materials remain available, people are going to find a way of working with physical object photography using analog methods and technologies. And I don't see why it should go away. There's a market for the stuff, and there's a market for education in the craft of making that stuff, and there's interest in making that stuff. So it's there, right? It's there in the cultural life of at least much of the world. So I think that's just going to go on, right? But it's going to become a very specialized craft, because most people who make photographs now for functional purposes do not need to know anything at all about analog photography.
I'll jump
So
in.
that's going to.
There is a. Sorry, go on. I'll come after.
No, it's fine.
There's a group of younger photojournalists, and they're not photojournalists who are going in and covering like immediate news, but they're doing a lot of editorial work for big labels, and they can't. When they started out a couple of years ago, like they couldn't afford a phase 1 camera system, which is what a lot of their older competitors were using. So a number of them turned to medium format color film, and they realized that they could buy an affordable scanner. You don't have to make actual prints. You pay a few dollars per roll of film. And now they've made huge careers out of it, because you do get a very large, in-depth amount of information from a medium format film scan that you could get with a phase 1 camera if you were able to throw down 30 grand. So in some ways that's a niche market, but at the same time they're kind of in every magazine and newspaper now. So they're keeping a lot of kind of interest in film among younger, especially men.
And you also have a lot of people who are in an area of, let's call it, issue-oriented photography, which falls more on the side of documentary than on the side of photojournalism, because the urgency of photojournalism, the deadline of photojournalism, to some extent, I would say it inhibits the use of, doesn't prohibit, but inhibits the use of analog materials.
Yeah, a lot of the time, like you're sending them remotely.
Right, because editors expect immediate, right? But documentary projects, by their nature, usually span a longer period of time, and don't have deadlines that are that urgent, and often part of the purpose of documentary is not simply to provide information that's useful now, but to provide some kind of permanent record of a group of people or of a situation or something like that. And therefore you've got documentary photographers who work very hard to craft something that is really going to last, and to craft something maybe that is presentable in a museum context or some context like that. So they're not so much making images for the printed page, right? They're making images for the wall, or they're making work for the wall. They're making work for the museum environment. They're making work that's going to function as some kind of installation space, and they're making work that's there, that basically is there for real contemplation rather than passing attention. So a lot of them are staying in analog. Well, I'm breaking down.
We're getting a little bit of weird buzzy feedback.
Let me unplug my mic for a minute.
I like your questions more than my questions so far. So let's keep on this.
If you have some more, I'm going to be running out soon.
Oh, yeah. No.
No.
Everyone get another donut. Put them back with you.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us? I think he's...
Well, he unplugged his headset, I think, so that's both his mic and his speaker. As a side note, not that it matters, but when you're talking about the photographer is going to use medium format to get the resolution, a lot of the higher-end Nikons and Canons now are getting to the point where they're pretty much on par with medium format. That some people will debate back and forth. 4x5, not quite yet.
Yeah,
Like give it like 2-3 years and.
Okay, how's this?
Yeah, good, perfect.
And I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I think there are a lot of people in documentary who are still, and probably will be, who are still working analog, and they may take their analog negatives and digitize them for various purposes, but they want the ability to make big prints, or they simply like working with those cameras and materials. So I don't think analog photography is just going to go away, but as I say, I think there's going to be a niche market for it in terms of both the imagery and the objects that are produced by analog photographers, and it's going to become a kind of a much smaller market, because most of what people are using now is digital imagery in many forms. I mean, even editors now are often crowdsourcing. I mean, picture editors at magazines are as likely to crowdsource images from some event than to actually hire a photographer to cover it or license work from a photographer. So that's a whole other aspect of the discussion, but the cohort of the people who provide images for media consumption has enlarged enormously as a result of digital imaging.
I'll tell you how you said you had some questions, so just
Give me a minute.
Share the floor a little bit here.
I'm drawing a blank at the moment. If you've got one on hand, go for it.
Okay.
This is my notebook.
Well, perhaps this is one. This is coming from our discussion a little bit last day when we were talking about Art Speak. And I actually went through, I read your article and also got into the page about the International Art English, and it was actually really quite entertaining. I really enjoyed it, actually. It's kind of fun little, particularly the translation into French, the poor translations, where it's something like materiality is the word used instead of material nature or something like that. It is, when you read it now, every time I see that, I'm going to think this is a bad translation of French.
Right.
But in terms of that art speak, I'm just wondering, this is sort of a weird prediction sort of question, but do you see it continuing on for an extended period of time and like really becoming firmly established as almost like a secondary dialect, as they were saying? Or do you see eventually people just getting tired of it and finally just being done with it and starting to speak in plain English again? Now, again, there is, motivations to keep it as sort of an elitist sort of thing as they're talking about, but I'm just wondering what your both predictions and desires, I guess, would be. I guess your desire is to get rid of it, but.
Yeah, my desire would be to see it go away now, if not yesterday.
Yeah. I got that from the last time.
And for people to get back to talking in something that we might call plain speech. Now, I have to qualify this, right? Every discipline, every field has its jargon, right? That's inevitable. If we think of it as shop talk, right? Every discipline, every craft has its shop talk, and therefore your mechanic, your car mechanic, when he's talking with his colleagues in the shop, has has certain kinds of terminology that they use as a kind of professional shorthand, right? But and if they want to mystify you when you come in and want to understand why your bill is so high for changing spark plugs, they may deploy that shop talk, right, to confuse you. But its purpose, in and of itself, is not to be uh, above your head. That's not its function. Its function is not gatekeeping. Its function is actually time saving, right? So that's a language of craft that's not available to someone who doesn't know the language of craft of that particular craft. But that's different from a jargon that has basically a gatekeeping purpose, whose function is to basically separate the cognoscenti from the great unwashed, and to obfuscate things. I'm not opposed to shop talk, right? And I have terms that I use, like the directorial mode, right? Which at some point I like to think no longer needs explaining, but did need explaining when I originated that term, because I wanted to be able to talk about staged photography without explaining what I meant by staged photography to everybody every time. So so in a sense that's a bit of shop talk that I originated, that got adopted. On the other hand, there's other terms that I use that have not been widely adopted or adopted by anybody except myself, and so to some extent I still gloss them periodically if I use them in my writing, because I don't want people to be mystified. What does Coleman mean by the autobiographical mode, or what does Coleman mean by this, or whatever. So so but that's different from a language that was created in academe for academics, as a way of academics impressing each other and impressing themselves. That's a different thing, and that's how I see art speak. Right, created within a very certain circle, not so much to clarify things, because I don't think it does most of it clarify anything, but to basically say we know what this means and you don't. Right, and therefore we're in with the in crowd and you're not. And that function of it is very disturbing to me and always has been, because partly because it's completely opposite to what I want to do with my language and my communication, which is precisely to say you are welcome here. I am talking to you, and you are welcome, and I am trying to talk to you in what I think is a vocabulary you will understand, which doesn't mean that you will have all the reference points that I'm bringing to it, right? But that the vocabulary I'm using is a vocabulary that you can understand, right? It may be a wide vocabulary, but it's not. I use very few, I think, arcane terms, and I have readers who say, well, I have to read you with the dictionary, but that's not my intent, And my response to them, although I would not say it to them because it would be rude, was you sort of need to get out more. You need to read more. You need to read more widely, because I'm not using words that are particularly obscure or hard to understand for, I think, the average educated reader. So I'm concerned with it because it seems to me that the function of that art speak is it narrows the discourse on photography and art. It narrows in a sense the audience, for not for the art necessarily, but for writing about art, by basically it's a kind of a keep out sign. You're not wanted here unless you understand what these terms mean, or even more specifically, unless you understand what we intend to signify by these terms, which may be actually very vague.
Yeah.
And I mean, how many people do you know who really ever sit down and want to have a serious discussion about the relationship between the signifier and the signified. I mean, have you? I mean, is this truly a matter of deep concern to anybody you know?
Do you just feel the urge from time to time? Get
Over
a
a couple
bit
of drinks.
idiotic?
Yeah, but you control it somehow, right? Yeah, you get a grip. Um, so that's what concerns me is that my goal has always been to try and broaden the discussion, the debate around photography as much as possible, which is partly why I like to write for general audience magazines and newspapers, because I think that's where I'm most likely to encounter people who are interested in photography but not specialists in the field. I mean, it's not that I don't write for specialists in the field, and it's not that I don't appreciate the fact that they read me, and sometimes I do write for them. But my main goal is to write for a broader audience than that, and the only way to do that is with a vocabulary, with a language, with a form of discourse that is basically enjoyable reading, and is basically within the grasp of an educated person who, if they don't know a particular word, can infer its meaning from the context. You know.
Now, do you see, the part of the question was also, what do you sort of predict will happen with this? Again, it's a hard sort of thing to say, but do you see it becoming worse and just sort of becoming more and more, like the text being more and more obfuscated and just sort of really, really narrow and, okay. So that is what
it's not something that just sort of goes away and everybody goes back to plain speech, you know, even plain educated speech. It becomes ingrained. It becomes it's the language of the stuff that you, I suspect, Dave, having just finished your PhD, were required tacitly, but were required to read and to couch your dissertation in. I'm willing to bet. You know, maybe you too, Ruth. You know, you had to use a certain vocabulary. There had to be a certain set of references that you had, whether that was Lacan or Baudrillard or whatever, right, or Flusser or whatever. There's a certain set of footnotes that you had to have, or a menu of same from which you could choose, right?
I have a question. Do you think that there is a relationship, like you are predicting that this situation will become worse? So do you think there is a relationship between the trying to make art practice more accepted in the academic world, like the proliferation of PhD, especially coming from Europe, but there are now in the US as well, 2 programs in Canada, some universities now advertising for studio, like visiting artists or art professors, tenure track, you have to have a PhD, preferable. So is there a kind of getting worse because of this as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that it's got a great deal to do with an attempt to academicize studio art, which is in a sense always problematic as an activity, but to try to sort of quantify what it is that a studio artist would know and systematize it. You know, the guiding principle of the French Academy was control instruction and you will control style. Right. That was the guiding principle of the academy, and I think in some ways that is always the guiding principle of the art academy. The goal is to control style. So there's all this talk about diversity and oppositional and all that yada yada, but the fact of the matter is that the goal, that the output of that, present company accepted, obviously, the output of that often, too often, I think, is a kind of homogenized look to the work that is not at all challenging. I did a whole series at the blog about what I see as one of the effects, the homogenizing effects of art education is a certain kind of image, and putting the subject matter aside, the image structure is always the same. Whatever a subject has been chosen, that subject is the largest thing in the picture frame. It is centered in the picture frame. It is the closest to the foreground in the picture frame. It is in sharpest focus, and all of the highlights, if it's a black and white image, or all of the most intense colors, are on that object. And it doesn't matter whether that is widows of violence in Northern Ireland, or veterans of post-traumatic stress disorder, or 20 used pocketbooks that I bought in my local thrift shop and froze in blocks of ice and photographed in my studio. The image is the same picture, and this is the entire German school, pretty much. You know, Gursky and the Beckers, etc. But it is MFA thesis project after MFA thesis project after MFA thesis project. It is the same picture over and over again. As a visual structure, it is the same picture repeated 20 times or 40 times for a thesis or a book. And the exploration of the possibilities of different visual structures within images is pretty much gone from the academic art environment in favor of a kind of typological collection of stuff which can be easily rationalized. I mean, it's very easy to create an unimpeachable thesis project if you're going to do 40 portraits of veterans of post-traumatic stress disorder with their statements that they've either written themselves or that you've tape recorded and transcribed and edited with them, right? You can't say no to that as a thesis project. Who could say no, right? I could much more easily see saying no to Dave's thesis projects, which are quirky and idiosyncratic and weird ass, etc. And I suspect that you had a harder time getting them. I suspect you had a harder time getting them past your thesis committee than you would have if you were going to photograph 40 homeless people, in downtown London or wherever you did your thesis, with their statements about what it means to be homeless. Right? I think that would have been a slam dunk, right?
Yep.
The thesis committee would have been glad to hear it because they wouldn't have had to think about it. You don't have to even defend that thesis. Who could say no? What could not be socially valuable and culturally valuable? That the pictures would be boring as dog shit, you'll excuse me, because they'd all be the same picture, just put a different person in front of the camera or do them in their environments, whatever, right? Wouldn't matter. Because the thesis would be unimpeachable. The thesis would be academically completely acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I see this as a problem in academe is that in order to make it easy for a thesis committee to validate someone's project, people tend to gravitate to the projects that make it easy for the committees to validate. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. What's easier than a collection of something that's all the same, right? That nobody has done. And it's easy to say, well, nobody has done a group, a study of a group of homeless people in downtown London with their own statements, right? So, new knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Right. Can't beat it.
Political
correctness. You don't even have to look at the result, unless they really screw it up in some way. It's done, and there's a level on which, frankly and cynically, I would advise people who are going to get MFAs or going to get art studio PhDs to pick a project like that just to get themselves out,
And there is pressure to do so.
You may or may not have had to fight with your thesis committee for your projects, Dave. You can talk about that in a second. But if you did, why not just do those projects, which obviously you love to do, right? But do the homeless people of London, to get the degree, right? I mean.
Well, I think for me, it wasn't so much, I didn't have much resistance in terms of what projects to choose. It was just more how I had to write about them was more
Okay.
difficulties. Like there was a fairly big flexibility in terms of what I could do,
All
but you
right.
had to frame them in a certain way that sort of fit with these standard
Okay.
conventional forms. So that's more the difficulties I faced. So
Right.
fortunately, I had a fairly open mind in terms of what I could do. But
Well, that's good.
and again,
Then you
also my
were.
panel, I had a philosopher, an art historian, and a photographer. So it was
Hmm.
also a different. It wasn't all photographers sort of on my panel.
Right.
So that could be part of it, where the writing and the more contextualization in a sort of theoretical context was more the problematic part, where it's like do the art as long as you can frame it
Right.
in a
Just
way.
justify it in some way.
Yeah, but justify it in a way
Yeah.
that's it fits nicely within the conventions of academia.
Yeah.
That's where I
Well,
had a bit of struggle, and I think to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of just probably shouldn't be saying this, but just sort of doing what needed to be done to get it accepted, and
yeah.
just kind of yeah, yeah, I know.
Well, believe it or not, I don't entirely object to this in the sense that if it's going to be a genuine thesis,
Mhm.
then I believe it should do what a thesis traditionally was meant to do. It should fill a gap in the literature, which is very hard to claim an art project does, right? It should be something that could succeed or fail, right? It should be a testable hypothesis in some way, rather than just doing the stuff you want to do
Mhm.
and figuring out some way of putting it in slippery language.
Mhm.
Present company accepted, of course.
Oh God.
Uh, and so there have been a couple of cases where I've been thesis advisor for someone, not in a doctoral thesis, but in an MFA thesis situation, where I've come in sort of mid project with them, where basically they were simply doing what they wanted to do, but which was often very interesting, but not necessarily a thesis. And part of my role as the advisor was to say, okay, how do we reconstruct the way you're thinking and talking about this to to be more of a thesis, right? So it's not just you doing what you want to do, which is not a thesis. Um, and so I've worked with people to try to find ways of getting them to think about a project, maybe take on different aspect of the project that they hadn't thought of before or something like that. So it became a little more like an actual doctoral dissertation. And I haven't gone through it. I actually was in a media studies program and got within about 6 credits of ABD, all but dissertation, but had a dissertation topic and had a dissertation committee picked out, and life got in the way. Anyhow, so I know that process. I understand that process pretty well from personal experience, as well as from being a teacher and reading people's dissertations and so on. And I believe in that. I think that's a good process, right? I believe in the idea of there being a question that you're asking that hasn't been asked before, which is not just here's something I want to do, but it's an actual question, and being a question that the answer can be proved, or that your thesis can be proved or disproved. But the point is that what I always say to my advisees is that if it's a genuine thesis, and if your committee signs off on your project and your methodology, then they can't object to it at the end,
Mhm.
right? That's in the nature of a thesis, like a scientific experiment. If you frame a scientific experiment with your question and your methodology and your thesis, etc., and the experiment fails, it's still a successful experiment, right? And if it's an experiment you're conducting for a thesis, you should still get your doctorate.
Mhm.
The answer was simply, this doesn't work,
That's
right?
valid. That's
That,
valid.
that's not a failed thesis project,
Yeah.
right? It's a failed experiment, but a successful thesis project because you've demonstrated that doesn't work, right?
Mhm.
Right. So you've demonstrated that you cannot do successful portraits of the homeless of London with your 1 pixel camera
Uh-huh.
and communicate anything of sociological value about them, right?
Mhm.
So
Oh,
that's
it could be an interesting project to do.
but it's a
You know, that could be part of it.
feel free to take it and run with it, Dave. But I think going back to the original question, yeah, the whole a lot of the purpose of this is to create something that resembles what non-scientists think of as the mystique of science and quantification and scientific language around what are basically usually one-off eccentric creative projects. Have any of you read about the Alan Sokal social text?
Yeah.
You know about
Yeah, yeah,
this.
yeah.
Okay. Um, I mean, for those of you who haven't, Sokal is a physicist at New York University who, upon reading some material that his wife, who's in the humanities, was reading, discovered that there was a great deal of use of scientific terminology and scientific versions of scientific ideas in postmodern discourse, and all of which, from his standpoint, was complete bullshit. And so he created a paper called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Quantitative Human Hermeneutics of Gravity, something like that. It's basically art speak nonsense. It has no meaning at all. And he submitted it to a very reputable journal called Social Text, which published it. And this created an international scandal that still resonates, actually. You can find all this material online, including the original article and so forth. Yeah, and he's written a couple of wonderful books, etc., based on it. But if you just Google Alan Sokal, Sokal, social text, you'll come up with it, and you really ought to read it because it's an example of how desperately the humanities want to scientificate themselves within academia, because that's where the money is, frankly. And that's where the reputation, if you're a science, you have higher standing in academia than you're a humanity. And if you can scientificate your humanities area, you have upped your grantability and your status and your ability to get tenure and all of those things. So a lot of this is the use of scientific quantificational language in areas that are ridiculous when you think about it in those terms. But that's an impulse that's going on, and that's part of what's driving all of this. I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse.
There was I don't want to throw a whole other thing in because it could go onto a huge tangent, but there was a really decent Charlotte Cotton essay recently about the academic world not being ready to respond to a legion of young artists who aren't going to school, who are working 9-to-5 jobs or part-time jobs to finance their own careers, and then they're making it big on the internet. So they're making it big in the art market, and their work is selling for tons of money. They're not really partaking in this discourse, and then there's a weird movement with the Academy trying to catch up to them, to try to figure out how to run a lingo around it, or to even just get on board with collectors who are buying all these works. So I want to know how you see the art market working either in tandem with the Academy. Like, how do you see that operating in the middle of all of this conversation that we've been having? Does it have a heavy hand in what kind of work is being produced or what work is being seen?
Oh, I think it definitely does. I think certainly in my field, in photography, and my corner of all this, photography, photo-based art, etc. As I was saying, work all looks the same. It all bears that kind of academic imprint, and I see project after project after project that look the way I was describing a few minutes ago. With that sort of typological studies of this or that, with the pictures all basically in the same visual format. So I see it happening increasingly, and of course schools now are, and this horrifies me, are inviting collectors in to do studio visits to people's thesis shows, et cetera, et cetera. I take a very traditional and conservative view here. I think that your academic experience should be insulated from the market as much as possible. I think you should be free to experiment and fall on your face without concern for marketing. And I think that the idea of encouraging collectors to come in to basically buy the work of students while they're in their student period is a terrible idea. But the students who get purchased, of course, don't feel that way and don't necessarily agree with me. But I'm actually pleased to hear, I didn't know this, Ruth, that there are students out there or artists, young artists out there who are avoiding school altogether and just going directly to the market, to the collector. I think that's brilliant. I think that's a great idea. I would absolutely encourage it. But the problem for you guys is that you're investing a huge amount of money in getting your certification, your academic certification. I don't know why you're doing that.
Canada grad school is pretty well funded, so.
Okay, all right.
So we're actually.
Okay, all right.
Grad school is sort of a very low-paying job, like kind of a poverty-level job, but
it's a very, very poor.
Yeah, we're also teaching and stuff too, but.
Yeah, well, this is probably then like parts of Western Europe where it's the same way, but and Northern Europe. But if that's the case, all right, so you're not going to end up with huge amounts of student debt. But I don't see any reason why you need to go through that certification process. Again, as far as I know, I don't know how true this is in Canada, but the only value of the MFA, the only professional value of the MFA is if you want a teaching job.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the MFA, and increasingly, it seems you're going to have the PhD, the art PhD.
Yeah.
The studio PhD, right? That's the new, the new level. But I've never known a critic or a historian or a curator or a gallerist who looked seriously at where a person had gone to school, right? I mean, yeah, if they're going to write about the person, then it's important to know what their something about their personal history. But I've never known anybody who said, well, I'm not going to write about her or him because they didn't go to art school, or I'm not going to write about her or him because they didn't go to Yale, or I only write about people who go to Yale or whatever. There may be.
Photography has a certain cachet to it, though.
What does?
Photography specifically has a certain cachet to it, does it not?
Does it now? I don't know. It always used to be the second-class citizen of the art world.
The program for photo stuff.
Oh, for Yale, you mean? Yale, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah.
They have a certain. That's one program in particular. I think has a certain.
Yes, Yale specifically has certain lines of influence that are valuable to buy if you've got the money for it, right? But I don't know a particular critic who says, well, I only write about Yale photographers, or I prefer Yale photographers. So it's not necessary for having a career as an artist. It's only necessary. I'm talking about the MFA now or the PhD, the art PhD. They're only necessary if you want to teach art, right? And the number of opportunities for teaching art post-secondary vis-a-vis the number of people getting those degrees, the statistic is horrific. I mean, you can have 600, 700 applicants for a single job opening, not even tenure track.
Mm-hmm.
So the likelihood of anybody in that room there getting a teaching job is really slim.
Mm-hmm. I'm very aware of this, particularly right now.
Okay, and I'm telling you this right after graduation, in case no one has said this to you, and in case this hasn't occurred to you before. I hate to be the one breaking the bad news.
Oh, no, I've went into this knowing that was the case.
You get night sweats about it.
So, I mean, this doesn't mean it's totally pointless. I mean, if you got something valuable out of your time in school, you got something valuable out of your time in school.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it no longer has much professional importance unless, again, with the exception of a teaching position. So unless you're interested in teaching, or unless you see that as a likely way of you supporting yourself, why would you spend all that time And whatever money you spend in school, rather than simply support yourself somehow, some other way, do your work and find a market. Or even find some entirely other way of supporting your work, so you don't have to find a market, or you can find a market at your leisure, right? I would see that as perfectly viable, and probably today, given the internet, as much more viable than it ever was. Because there are just so many more ways of publicizing your work than there were 25, 30 years ago. And getting the word out about your work and building a community around your work of at least viewers and possibly collectors. That I would see it as a very viable alternative path to that, and that in itself is going to challenge the academic art environment, because as more and more people do that, take that path, because the prices of education are not coming down anytime soon. The prices of post-secondary art education are not coming down. They may be better in Canada than they are here, but they're I'm sure it's not insubstantial. So if the prices are going to stay the same and there's other paths, then the academy is either going to have to find some way of co-opting those other paths, or or integrating those other paths. You're probably going to see courses for credit. This is a prediction. It may already exist, but this is one of my predictions. You're going to see courses in credit in art departments on using social media to further your art career. Right? You're going to see those as courses. Now, the fact is that everybody entering an art department today probably knows more about social media than anybody teaching in an art department today. Right? I mean, any student coming in probably does more Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, etc., than anybody who's going to teach them that course. But you're going to see courses in this for credit, right? And that'll be one way for the academy to co-opt non-academic artists' uses of social media, et cetera, et cetera. There'll be the designing your website, there'll be the use of social media, there'll be all of these, right, as ways of trying to co-opt that. So it's perfectly possible that, I mean, I don't know how registration is running in art departments in Canada right now. You guys would have a better idea than I. Is that stable? Is that falling? Is that rising? My guess would be that in this economy, it's falling.
No, it was rising.
Was it? Okay.
Oh, yeah, it's very competitive.
Well, I thought the number of applicants, I don't know.
Yeah, like applications.
I think it's going down. That's what I've been.
In graduate level?
Undergrad.
Okay. In graduate level, it's very competitive.
It's competitive, but it's competitive among what number of people?
Keep in mind, there's not a lot of spots for the grad students.
So we only have, most of the universities in Canada have 5 people they can accept every year for graduate MFA program. Only 5. We don't have these big programs like the Art Institute of Chicago, which has 200.
Right. Oh, okay.
So we have 5, and there's a lot of people applying.
Right. Well, okay. And how many programs are there?
There's quite a few like MFA programs. Far fewer in the US, obviously.
But a number. Give me a number.
Oh,
there's 100.
20? It's like a 20, 30, somewhere in that area.
Yeah.
It's a total guess number, but probably somewhere in that area, 20 or 30, I would guess. Maybe, yeah, around that, I think.
So you've got 30 MFA programs all across Canada, and they can only accept 5 each. Well, of course, that's going to be highly competitive. You're talking about 150 slots. Yeah. So they don't have to worry. I don't know how they get by with only 5 students, but they don't have to worry. But down here, they've got to worry.
Well, part of it, I think, too, is also, as I said, we're funded normally for graduate programs.
Right.
So as opposed to in the States where you have these 20 students or however many coming in all paying, they're going to take as many as they can. But when they're actually supporting and funding, there's limited resources that are available. So I think that might be, this is total conjecture, but that would be one of my guesses why the programs might be smaller.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have fewer programs, that they're way smaller, and so it's understandable that given the number of people in Canada who might want to go to art school, that it would be very competitive there. But here I think I think that enrollments have leveled off and have started to decline, and therefore the schools have to offer more and more various kinds of financial support.
Mm-hmm.
I know that at NYU, where I've taught, although not particularly recently, but I was there for a semester a year ago, and they have, I forget how many, undergraduate photo program. They must have a couple hundred students, and I think almost all of them are getting some level or other of financial support. And that's a very expensive school. That's something like $50,000 a year just for tuition. So it's humongous cost, and that's not even your materials, and of course that's not your living costs in New York. Um, so I think that they're going to have to either find ways of adapting to a new environment in which more and more people are going to not go to school for art, but are going to become artists, or those programs are going to shrink, and maybe some of them will shrivel and die, and maybe that would have some effect on the environment for a jargonized art discourse. But I don't think any of that's going to happen soon. I think that's all going to be very gradual.
Hmm.
And I think even a lot of those people who are not going to art school but are entering the art market directly are still going to jargonize and theorize their writing because that's what's expected.
Sure.
Galleries expect that, collectors expect that, the art magazines expect that, etc.
Yeah, you can access it all on the internet, as you say, with
Yeah.
study. So it's kind of a
Hey, you can subscribe. You can subscribe to eFlux and just read that stuff for 6 months, and it'll come out in your sleep.
yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that this is a nice place to wind down. It's been like a really
Sure.
far-reaching discussion. I don't know if you have any last
Um,
minute.
Nothing in particular. I think I've exhausted a lot of my questions.
Mm-hmm. Open the
Good.
floor to any last minute. Okay. Well, thank you for your time as always.
Okay. All right.
I look forward
You're
to
very
seeing this
welcome.
on the internet.
Yep.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
We'll see you next time. This has been great. Thanks,
Good.
Dave.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, Alan.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.